Welcome to the Boys and Girls Club National Photography Program. My name is Ryan. I'm a photographer. And today we're going to be talking about taking better photos. We want to set you up to be able to get out there with your camera and just take really beautiful pictures. What is a photograph? So taking photographs is all about capturing light. Whether it's on a sensor in your digital camera or on a piece of film, you are capturing the world around you with the light that's coming into your camera. And so when you're capturing that light, it's something called exposure. So when you take a picture, you're exposing your sensor in your camera to light, and this is how it captures the information. This is called the exposure. When you're exposing for a photograph, your camera is doing a couple things, and sometimes your photo will be underexposed, which means that you didn't capture enough light. Sometimes, when you capture too much light, it's called overexposed. But if you set it and have just the right amount of light, it's called the correct exposure. So exposure is affected by three settings on your camera. Those settings are the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Each of these things affect your images in different ways. The first one, aperture, is the actual opening in your camera. This is about the amount of light that gets in. So you can have a large aperture opening, like the one on the left, or a small aperture opening, like the one on the right. On camera, this is measured in f-stops. And it's a little weird because f-stops, when you are at a small f-stop, the opening is bigger, and when you're at a large f-stop, the opening is smaller. So when you're down at an aperture, like f4, you close down the hole by making the number higher up to f22. Apertures can also go as high as f32 or f36 and as low as 1. When you have an aperture that's a little bit open too wide, like f4, your image can be overexposed. You're letting too much light through the aperture. If you're letting too little light through the aperture, if the hole is too small, you get an underexposed picture. When you're letting just the right amount of light in, you get a correct exposure. So one more thing that aperture does that's really important is it does something called depth of field. And that's how much of the image is in focus. So when your aperture is large, when there's a large hole, you have a shallow depth of field. So the A is in focus, but the other letters are not in focus. When you close it down to a higher f-stop, you get a deep depth of field. So a lot more of the image is in focus. The next thing that affects your images is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is how fast your image sensor is exposed. So there's a shutter in front of your sensor, and that moves out of the way and exposes the sensor to light. How fast that happens is called the shutter speed, and it can be measured in a second or a couple of seconds and fractions of a second, like a thousandth of a second. It can be very fast or very slow. So a slow shutter speed is going to cause lots of blur in your picture. On the one on the left, he's dribbling a basketball, but because the shutter speed was slow, it looks really blurry. When you have a fast shutter speed, it freezes the image. There's no blur there because it's opening and closing so fast that it's capturing all the light really quickly. And that's called a fast shutter speed. The last thing that affects your images is called the ISO. And the ISO is a measure of how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. So it can start as low as 50 ISO and go up to 25,000 or 30,000. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. And this affects your image in a certain way. If the ISO is really high, like 25,600, the image gets grainy or noisy. You'll see it starts to break apart. It's like salt and pepper on the image. If it's a lower ISO, the image is a bit sharper and has less noise or grain. Okay, let's review what we just went over. In this one, the aperture, is it large or small?
It's large because not all the picture is in focus.
That's correct. And what do we say when the entire image isn't in focus? It's a depth of field. Is it shallow or deep?
Shallow depth of field.
That's correct. So shallow depth of field, not a lot of the image in focus. It's a larger aperture. Okay, the exposure. Over, under?
It's overexposed.
And why is that overexposed?
It's white and it doesn't have a lot of detail.
That's right. That's right. So there's a lot of light that's been captured here. It's too much light for you to be able to see all the detail. So it's overexposed. Okay, shutter speed.
Fast.
How can you tell that it's a fast shutter speed?
Because it's not blurry.
That's right. So you see she's jumping out of the water, and the water is frozen in midair, and she's frozen in midair, and there's no blur. So no blur means it's a fast shutter speed. ISO, high or low?
High.
And why would you say it's high?
Because it's too grainy in the picture.
That's correct. It's grainy. So you know it's a higher ISO because the image is grainy. Okay, so now we're going to do an activity. We're going to split into groups, and each of you is going to be assigned a different setting that we went over in this lesson: aperture, ISO, shutter speed. So you're going to adjust those on your camera and see how they affect your pictures. So let's go take some pictures. Okay, so that's the end of session 1. We went over exposure, which is the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed settings on your camera. So I think you should be ready to go out and take some good pictures. Thanks.